Well, thanks, Dave, and thanks, Peter, for that. There's an awful lot of material that lies behind what they're talking about, and lots of it pretty technical. So we can dig into that, or we can go somewhere else, and I'm opening the floor to questions. There's got to be somebody who's going to jump up and ask a question sooner or later. I don't see anybody right now, so over here. Great, we've got two. Okay.
I just wanted to get a clarification. You mentioned $2 billion. Is that the federal? Is that the federal subsidy still?
The federal subsidy right now, after the reductions and everything, we figure with oil, and so as part of the GBC process, we sort of redid it because the accelerated capital cost allowance in 2007 is now being phased out. So we retumbled the numbers. It's about 1.4 billion a year. And the other number was the provincial. There's significant provincial. Okay. I think all in all, I forget, it's been a while, but it was 2.4 billion in total. But the federal piece, and I do caution, like that number, again, these are hard numbers to get a handle on, and when we talk to people and tax experts, our numbers are likely a little high. But I think we're in the order of magnitude. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, there's somebody right behind you had their hand up. So.
I was just wondering if there's been any thought to creating a public database with these partners so that more work can be done in this area of maybe all the subsidies that are available in Canada, maybe the difficulties around that, because it is really difficult to get this data. But maybe if 3 partners contributed and year after year as the budget phase some of these out and it's updated, it might be easier to do more research on it. I was just wondering if you could comment.
Peter, sounds like a GSI question.
Sounds like a Green Budget Coalition question, doesn't it?
Yeah, a little different.
Andrew here. Yeah, I think the Green Budget Coalition's done a fantastic job on this to get those numbers out. If you look at any country, and used to say, which countries have got really good databases on their subsidies? Hardly any. There's a start on that, which is the OECD has, for the last 3 years, I think now, gone through their members' tax codes and their members' policies, and so they're given quite a tight definition. This is what we believe governments are giving to their oil and to their fossil fuel producers and consumers, and I think that's probably the best source of information for developed countries. On the developing country side, there's clearly the IEA stuff on price cap is fine. It's easy to calculate subsidies for developing countries on consumer prices, much harder on producers. So I think OECD is probably the best place for that, but I think it does need to be supplemented sometimes by the work we've done here, by the work Dave and Andrew are continuing to do. But that's a national initiative. It's a bit big for us to take on as GSI.
Yes, I'm really appreciative that you're doing this work. I'm sort of a little shocked when the government doesn't know how much it's giving the oil companies. I'm wondering, I'm very conscious of the IPCC report, which just came out that basically told us that we need as a world to be moving to renewable energy in the next 50 years with a very aggressive thrust in that direction in the next 20. And I believe that is important. So I'm wondering, how can we use this system that you're studying in such detail to actually be a disincentive for oil and gas exploration, not be looking for new sources of oil and gas, and instead turn those energy companies into real energy companies that are investing in renewable energy?
It's a good question. How to respond. You know, we've done a lot of work thinking about how do we transition our economy to low carbon, clean energy futures. It's been ongoing. It's tough. I mean, I think the basic problem is that petroleum is and energy is so embedded in absolutely everything we do, and to think that we can, design policy, grand policy to deal with it in a really rapid sort of manner has proven to be really, challenging and elusive. So it's, you've articulated really nicely where we want to go. It's just proving really hard at so many levels in so many countries to get there. And, so the idea here is to reveal it, right? In the past, maybe we don't know. So we have that narrowed order of instruments, but we don't know, whether it matters or not, perverse subsidies. So, information matters. It's helpful for decision making, and, we want to sort of reveal that stuff when we can.
To add to that, there is a positive, at least at international level, that the World Bank has 4 climate change priorities. One of those is reform energy subsidies. That came out with President Kim last year. The IEA has recognised 4 policies that should happen quickly as we build up to a 2020 hopeful international agreement on climate change. One of those is subsidy reform. So the issues become really mainstream, and I think the sort of comment you made just now is now part of the mass debate and the normal way of thinking, which is progress. But the actual, and going back to my presentation earlier, the effort of reform is very much a national one, and it's politics and it's political economy.
Have Marjorie, and then in front.
Most of the discussion, or all of it, has been about fossil fuels, and I'm wondering if you could comment on the factors that make ethanol subsidies either good or not so good from a sustainable development perspective.
Peter.
I'm glad you asked that question. We've had a lot of, I alluded to some interesting conversations in the European Union debate this year, where we came out with some work that said there were around €6 billion worth of subsidies, so $8 billion or so in the EU going to ethanol and to biodiesel. In our view, we said that they were not acting for sustainable development, should be reformed. The biofuels industry is effectively supported by subsidy. If there wasn't a subsidy, there wouldn't be a biofuel industry. It's as simple as that. So they're playing a big game. If those subsidies go, their industry goes. They say, we've invested all this money. They make claims about the number of jobs that are associated with that and so on. I think a first point is that there are big differences between biodiesel and ethanol, and that's very important to recognise. In climate change terms, often biodiesel is negative on climate change. When you factor in the land it might use and the indirect effects as well, you often end up with more emissions coming from biodiesel than the diesel it replaces, which is clearly perverse. Ethanol performs better on that task, but it still appears to us to be it's an expensive policy when you compare it to the aims it's trying to achieve. So if you look at its role in energy security, or its role in reducing climate change, or in generating net jobs, it does perform a positive role on most of those, but it's very expensive. There are better alternatives available, would be our argument on that.
Okay.
Well, the related point, the subsidies don't always have to be from government, from tax expenditures, right? There's cross-subsidization between consumers and industry. So our content mandate for both ethanol and biodiesel in Canada are, clear subsidies to the sector from consumers through gas purchases. So, it's fairly easy actually to figure out what that is, given the, it's a mandated content standard. We know the value of fuel. We know what the, feedstocks cost, all that sort of thing. And it's not inconsequential, because you think about 10% of all our fuel is ethanol, and it's a higher priced product. So, yeah, and setting aside the environmental benefits.
There's a GSO report from, I think, 2007, or with data of 2007, which could do with being updated. And I think that's another sort of lesson from this debate, is that there aren't people going around performing like this public service, if you like, of getting all the data and the information, that we need to have these discussions properly. And it's not a huge task. The study that Dave did for us a few years ago took us, 8-9 months? It wasn't a huge task. It wasn't a huge task. You just say go. But it's not millions. So it can be done, and I think this requires a bit of collaboration.
Margaret, just if I can jump in here, your question puts me in mind of some work we did in Arcan when I was there, and it was probably when you were in PMO, looking at subsidies across the board, tax expenditures. And one of the things that was really striking that came out of that is that there were a lot of different parts of the energy system that were being subsidized, but there were two real outliers, and one in terms of a huge subsidy, mainly by virtue of being exempt from the fuel excise tax, was ethanol, and it was way off the scale. The other one that was way off the scale in the other direction was energy efficiency, and there's some technical reasons in the tax system why that was really hard to fix. But good question, because there's lots of sinning going on around the system. So next question.
Yeah, it's hard to disagree with anything you've said about subsidies, but I'm interested more in the relationship between regulation and subsidies. And it seems to me, if you look at environmental regulation in general in Canada, and you look at what the Sustainable Development Commissioner has been saying over the last few years, first of all, half of our regulations are written so badly they couldn't be enforced. The rest are not enforced anyway. So I just wonder if there's been any, how much research, if any, has been done on poor or poorly enforced regulation as a subsidy?
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, that's the nut of sort of regulatory,
I guess a couple of ones we've come across practically is we've worked in India a lot, and in India you have poor quality coal being mined and then often put into a power station right next door to generate electricity. And often in that, pressures are hard. The Indian government wants to keep electricity prices low to industry, to consumers, to irrigators, to everybody. So they want to keep the prices down for electricity generation. They don't always enforce environmental standards on those plants, and just simple things like dust collection and ESP and so on. And we've done some calculations of, if that particular regulation was properly enforced, how much money would that have cost them? That's not going the whole way down about external costs and CO2 and all this sort of thing, just the basic, assuming that the environmental regulation is the requirement and they're not enforcing it, there's a subsidy there. So that's one example. There's another one as well on sort of washing coal as well, similar sort of argument. So we've mostly looked at those, the coal, poor quality coal situation.
How we typically, how one would deal with that generally is you sort of identify, back to the identify, quantify. So our questions for the study were identify the subsidies, quantify where you can, and then monetize. And so you want to identify the full spectrum, and then when you do your reporting, you don't, everybody reports the 1.4 number or whatever it is out of the report, or what, the 6 billion in Europe number was all over Twitter. But they don't sort of reveal the rest of those things you've identified. So it's always good to have a page in there as a summary to say, okay, here's the number, but here are all the stuff we could, here's all the stuff we couldn't really get a handle on that's really uncertain and it's important for decision making. Anyway, that was a great question.
Okay, David.
Hi, Peter. When we started GSI, if you remember, we chose a deliberately conservative definition of subsidies. We used the WTO one because we thought that would be, our results would be less likely to be controversial. And the one thing we decided we would not do would be to sort of impute the cost of damage, for example. And interestingly enough, that's exactly what the most conservative possible financial institution, the IMF, has just done. And the IMF has just produced this report in which they estimate, when you add in the costs of global warming, the subsidies to the energy industry to be about $1.9 trillion a year, which is quite a figure. Interesting to me that it was the IMF that did this. The IMF is not known for methodological leaps into the unknown. Do you think we're now moving to a stage where, if not, it won't be obligatory, but certainly acceptable to begin to build into subsidies estimates the actual costs of externalities when they can be computed? And the 1.9 trillion they got by using, I think, $25 a ton, which came from a committee of very distinguished U.S. economists who've now since, I think, changed the estimate to $35 a ton. So the 1.9 trillion is probably an underestimate. Are we getting to the stage where we're going to be talking about subsidies on that scale? Because that's a completely different sort of political argument.
I think we are. I think we're seeing the beginning of that trend. And I think part of it is driven by countries around the world, and particularly in the developed world, have put a lot of money into renewable subsidies and sort of said, we don't think we can do much about internalising the external costs of climate change into fossil fuel prices, so let's do the opposite and put subsidies into renewables. They're now finding that some of those schemes that have not been cost effective, have not been well controlled and designed. So I think they're going back to the right principle of taxing the bad. On the sort of politics of that, from GSI perspective, we haven't tended to include carbon in our estimates. One reason is it can dwarf the financial estimate. If you put in $25, especially in a country like the US, I think, which has been the highlight of that report, US without CO2 taxes and taking a pretty conservative definition of subsidies. Subsidies are not that high. With them, it's very, very high. So that's put different countries in the frame. But what we've found is in the sort of politics of reform in the countries where we've been mostly working, Indonesia, India, Bangladesh, Vietnam, and so on, nobody's interested in CO2. CO2 is a rich country problem, rich country solutions. Once you start talking about that, you're deflected away from the key issue where we've been saying, very, very simple argument. If you get rid of your subsidies, you can save money you can spend on other things. And that's all we've needed, so we haven't done it for that basis. But I agree with your first question. I think it's coming in, and welcome. And really interesting that IMF is getting involved in this sort of issue. Fantastic.
Okay, John.
Yeah, in terms of advocating for support for what you're doing, what kind of reaction do you get from the larger business organizations, such as the manufacturers associations, the big business groups, or the chambers of commerce? And what are the odds of getting some of them to sign on, at least in principle, to what you're trying to do?
I think, well, the quick response is, why are you coming at us and not them, right? So it's sort of, they're sort of playing each other off a bit. So I don't see, when you do, I'll give you an example. So I'm trying to sort of characterize it properly, but so there's, IISD was sort of called, sort of lackey of the oil industry because Nestle was, you remember that story, the board member from Nestle was on Exxon, and then at the same time we were getting told we were the lackey of the, was it the ethanol?
NGOs and everybody. We're lucky of everybody. It's pretty
So we get that a lot. So when you sort of take this neutral view and land in the middle, you're sort of making everybody a little upset. And so we don't see a lot of unification around the table around the issue. It's generally pointing fingers a lot. I didn't articulate that great. Peter, what are your thoughts?
Okay. I guess the first reaction was, if you're looking for a business view on subsidies in a country, there isn't one, because there's so many different types of businesses. General business doesn't use a lot of energy. It's not energy intensive. If the prices of energy go up, it's not a big deal. If you look at a commercial enterprise, it's probably spending less than 1% of its revenue on energy. It's not a big deal. But then there are specific industries which are very energy intensive, and they've got a real view on this. And when you're looking at countries like Vietnam, which has brought in foreign direct investment on the basis that there are low energy prices, those companies then want to keep them. They say that's the basis for why we came here. If you change that policy, we're going to leave, and nobody wants that. But there's a whole spectrum, and one of the good analysis to do is look across the fuel supply chain. For example, you've got the producer at the top, and you're going all the way down through the distributors, the refiners, the people selling at the end, so on. They all have a different interest, and in different countries they're affected in different ways. And really, to get a handle on this issue, and when talking about the kind of reform process and influence, you've got to go through that process of saying who is affected by subsidy reform, how much, do we care about them, are they politically important, are they important for equity reasons, and then you've got to devise a strategy of either facing up to them or compensating them. And it's really hard to categorize business. It's so diverse.
Bob.
I probably need a microphone. First, I wanted to thank you for your candor. I appreciate you putting up the perspectives on both sides of the discussions that have gone on. I do want to highlight the one point you raised, the MIN study that was done
I think it's important if you're going to be analyzing this stuff to do it in a way that satisfies the best known methodologies. And Jack he's a pretty credible guy. He spent a great deal of his career, he's finance-based, he's coming from the sector that cares about trying to levelize tax models and the like. And he had several critiques that I think are relevant that should be considered in the analysis, but the most important one he focused on was, or his end point was, trying to find an economic characterization of what is arguably subsidy or not subsidy, and trying to cut through a lot of the noise, I guess, that you can run into with trying to do analytical work. So I think I would like to highlight that I think it is a valid perspective to consider as you're looking at this question, trying to benchmark against what is an economic reference point as to whether it's subsidized or not, because the oil and gas industry is pretty transparent, you get a lot of information out of that. There's other industries, I think, that are also affected in the same dynamics. Another point I wanted to sort of bring forward was that in the analysis of the sort of the broader picture of where all of this the externalities of it all, do you take in, or have you considered taking into consideration the relative quality of what resources are in play? For example, Canada is got some very good resources, but it's also extremely closely regulated and monitored and pretty transparent in how it generates its resources. And admittedly, it's getting better and better at reducing its GHG footprints, etc. Is it not logical to be looking at the big externalities pictures to say, well, maybe it's better for Canadian resources to be offsetting other less efficient resources that are being used in other countries that are generating greater environmental effect, negative effect, than it would be to use Canadian produced products that are carefully environmentally managed. It's just a question of how one looks at these things in the broad global scale. Yeah. I think Canada's trying to move down that front economically. It's trying to develop its export markets around marketing a high quality, lower footprint GHG product. Is that part of your mix? And when you look at
yeah, well, so we didn't look at externalities, but I would hide behind Environment Canada a bit here, which I don't do very often. But they have a social cost of carbon that says a ton of emissions in Canada has a certain level of damages. That's the social cost of carbon they talk about. And so they ran a bunch of models, they put a blue ribbon panel together, and they came up with this sort of estimate. So it's a very Canadian-centric damages estimate. So whether it's vehicle regulations or coal-fired power regulations or oil and gas regulations, they have that same dollar value for damages. So they're not differentiating. So the accounting stance, I guess what I'm saying is Canada, and we're looking sort of at Canadian damages, and we're not broadening it out. If you got into more of a global assessment, then perhaps you could differentiate, but it would get very complex and uncertain, I think really quick. I mean, it's already highly uncertain. So, yeah, I see what you're saying, but
It's kind of building on the argument that Peter raised, of some of the, I think there's some parts of the world that are very inefficient in the use of resources and creating great environmental effect for that.
Right.
It could be better managed by other protocols. Are we taking the credits of that to offset them? But just a question.
Sure, yeah, it's good.
Question for Peter. Given your knowledge of countries around the world and your knowledge of the Canadian scene, what do you see as the best opportunities for us to sort of expedite progress on subsidy reform in Canada?
I think people say that's a good question when they don't know the answer to it. Is that the normal way it works in this? It's country to country, but sort of alluding, sorry, I don't know the name of the previous questioner. Bob. Sorry, Bob. Going back to what Bob was saying, when we were thinking, this is the study that Dave did on the Canadian sector with GSI's help 3 years ago. We've only done 4 of those in the world. We've done Canada, we did first Indonesia, then we did Canada, then we did Norway, and then we did Russia. And in each of those, we found that if you put together a group of people and said, how big do you think the subsidies are in your country, and are they effective or not in their aims, lots and lots of different views. From Dave categorised it as an environment view and a development view and so on. More technically, I think there's an issue here about benchmarking. When we looked at these studies, we basically said there are 3 forms of preferential treatment we can see for a subsidy. Is there preference between different companies? And back to the question on business, people going into countries like Indonesia will say there are clear preferences for the incumbent state-owned enterprise here that we as foreign investors don't get. So that for us, there's a clear subsidy there. If they're getting a production sharing agreement that's better than other people can get, that's a subsidy. I think that's a lot of concern for more developed countries trying to expand their operations in developing countries comes around that. Second one is there a preference by industry? Are there subsidies that the oil industry is getting that the chemical industry doesn't, or vice versa? So you can set a benchmark on that basis as well. The harder one is how do you benchmark between countries? So if you say Canada has a fiscal and regulatory regime for its upstream oil and gas, US has a different one, UK has a different one, Indonesia has a different one, Nigeria has a completely different one. How do you benchmark across that? We haven't tried to do that yet, so that international comparison thing is really, really difficult. I think going back to your point about Jack Mintz as well, and the other studies, the other benchmarking work that's been done here, I think there's a real need to try and draw together people who are interested in these methodologies and data sources and say, have we got some sort of consensus around this? What is the right way to approach this problem? What sort of numbers do we come up with? That can be quite technical. There's then a further debate at the end of that, which is how do we evaluate those subsidies? And a lot of when people argue, they say we don't have any subsidies. What they're actually arguing is we have got subsidies in a technical definition, but we think they're good. And people will say that we need this extra exploration benefit, or extra development benefit because we get more activity, and that's a good thing for Canada or whatever country. Valid viewpoint, but that to us is a question after you estimate the scale of the subsidy. It's a question of evaluation. That's a very long answer to say it's hard to compare between countries. And I think if you want to sort of say, is Canadian oil better than Nigerian oil, better than Indonesian oil, better than US oil, that's the sort of comparison you have to get into. We've done 4 of these country studies. We hope other people will do more, and then we can kind of get a bit more of a comparison with that. Still haven't given myself really enough time to think about Andrew's question. What we've found, the 2 countries where we've made best progress as an institute, are Indonesia and India. Both large emerging economies, similar sorts of issues. They want to move to unsubsidized gasoline and diesel. In India's case, they've largely done it for gasoline, and they're working on the diesel problem. They've had a bit of progress this year. Indonesia's just every year trying to put up gasoline subsidies, actually did it this year. They actually raised the gasoline price for the first time since 2005, if you can believe that. They've actually had a capped price for gasoline for 8 years. And and every year, as the world oil price goes up in that period, it gets harder to bridge that gap. They've made some progress this year. They put it up by 30%. What we've found has worked is you've got to be in a country for a while. 2 years' work to build a network, build partners, build influence channels, continue to work with those people. We can do something as an international organisation, part of the issue. Others can do other things. And I think we've also spent a lot of time on communications, on publications, on working with media, on trying to get channels into parliaments. And we found that parliament in Indonesia, India is one of the key barriers. You can talk to the oil industry, you can talk to the ministries, you can talk to officials. They are generally rational, and you can understand where they're coming from. Parliament in Indonesia is different. They have different drivers of their behaviour, and so we need different arguments to talk to them and different ways of interacting with them. But without that, you don't get the push. So you've got to find ways of getting into the Parliament. If I sort of look around the room and I listen to the questions and look at the work that Dave's done and other people here, there must be a way of putting together a nice consortium here to go after this issue. It will require as well, though, advocacy organisations, people who want to do mass communication. It's not just a technical issue. You've got to build public support for reform is the question. Can you get the average Canadian in the street saying, I'm really against these energy subsidies, I want them out, it really matters to me. in what is, on the research side, a very technical, difficult issue. So that's getting in. I put on the slide for Indonesia350.org as a sort of mass media rabble-rouser, if you like. That's the sort of organisations you need to. We can't do that, IISD, GSI, partly by charter and partly it's not our expertise. We don't have the size, we don't have the expertise. But there's plenty of people here who do.
Do you, from this research, have a sense of the average citizen's awareness of fuel subsidies? Just from my level, I feel as though the average Canadian, for example, doesn't know about the amount to which fuel is subsidized. And I don't know if anybody else has experienced this, but there's been times when gas prices make a jump, and an old high school friend forwards me an email, angry vitriol about how we're being gouged, and the government and the fuel companies, they're all they're screwing us over, and on this date next week we're going to send a message and don't buy gas on that date, and it's just showing a complete opposite understanding of how we know this whole thing works. And so I'm wondering if you're saying. So I'm wondering about if we know the awareness of people's awareness of this issue, and also if they did know about it, would they care? Because when gas prices go up, people get upset.
I could certainly answer from the perspective of certain developing countries. Everybody knows about the subsidy. It's a huge topic of conversation, and it becomes, as Mike said right at the beginning, a moral hazard type issue and an entitlement type issue. People know. They might not know the exact numbers, but they know there is a subsidy. They know there is a benefit to them, and they're often strongly opposed to it. There's also, we've had a couple of workshops, another one coming up later this month, and then there was one last year, where we got together fuel price regulators from around the world, who are sort of people on the real front line of the subsidy issue, because they've got to set the new price and follow through on it. And there is concern in almost all countries that consumer markets for transport products don't work properly. So they say, look, prices go up, world prices, we get them straight away. World prices go down, our consumer prices don't go down. There's a real mistrust there. And there was a case in Germany last year, a huge case of how the gas station companies had basically worked as a cartel for many years and changed their prices at the same time and not operate in a competitive manner. So all the fuel price regulators at that workshop, who were sort of cross world, rich countries, poor countries, in between countries, and they were all concerned about trying to maintain their markets and how they worked properly for transport products. And it was an ongoing challenge for different reasons in different countries. I'm not sure about how much Canadians know about their subsidies. Dave knows.
Yeah. Is there opinion poll research? I'm unaware of it. Are NGOs increasingly, being vocal about the issue? Yes. Or do we see more articles and op-eds? Yes. Jack Mintz has a number of articles in the Financial Post over the last 3-4 years. He's done 2 or 3 articles on it, on the issue. And so, yeah, we're chugging along. But I think what's really different about Canada is GBC's entree into finance. Right, so you've got an environmental policy out of Environment Canada that's not really a line agency, that doesn't have a line ministry, that doesn't have authorities to tax and spend. Well, they can spend a bit, but they don't. It's not where everything goes down. So to the extent finance gets involved, let me back up. The GBCC process is really neat. So if you have a proposal, say more parks in Canada, you deal with Environment Canada and the parks people, and they sort of get them involved. And then finance says, well, what does parks say? If they like it, okay, and aligns with our objectives, let's take the recommendation on. But on the subsidy issue, because the tax expenditure is sitting in the tax code, we deal with finance officials. So we're sitting there with finance. So it's been highly effective, moving forward. So one could argue that you don't necessarily, in this case, you circumvented the need for, the public being outraged about it, because you've gone straight to the, heart of the matter in a quiet, clean sort of way. And that, so knowing your spheres of influence, it matters, I think.
There's also, I think, another point to bring there. If the country's subsidies are mostly on the producer side, that probably doesn't translate to any change in the price at the pump. So the producers will make more or less money depending on the subsidy side, but it doesn't make oil products in that country cheaper or less expensive. The oil market is a huge world market. Slightly different amounts of production in countries doesn't make a huge amount of difference to it. So translation from producer subsidy to gas prices basically isn't one.
Okay, we've got time for a few more questions, so there's one and then another.
I didn't introduce myself earlier when I spoke. I'm Dennis Howlett with the Canadians for Tax Fairness, and we're developing a whole tax loopholes campaign, and considering where or what we should do with the fossil fuel tax expenditures. And I think you're right. There is some openness in finance. It's partly because the finance minister has been at all these international G20 meetings and so on. He has been exposed to some of the thinking and the peer pressure. And I think there is an opportunity, given last budget, which did identify tax fairness and closing loopholes as one of their priorities. I do think it's an opportunity. There have been some environmental groups have campaigned on the fossil fuel subsidies a few years ago, but I think it's maybe time to mount a new campaign with a broader coalition that goes beyond just environmental groups to other groups as well. I just had a meeting this morning with the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, and there are other business groups that have an interest in simplifying the tax code, such as the accountants, and I think we could put together a broader coalition to really put a push on at least the tax expenditure side, which is in the purview of the finance ministry, and get somewhere on this in the next year or two if we could mount a major campaign. But I think it probably requires something beyond just the environmental group sector, given the political dynamics in Canada at the moment. But I think there is some potential there, and it would be really interesting to talk to anybody else who's interested in putting together such a coalition.
Just an observation on that.
There's one more final thing. The finance ministry does every year produce a tax expenditure estimate, which has blanks about the fossil fuel part of it, even though they quantify a whole lot of other tax expenditures. And I think one place to start would be to push them to include in their annual tax expenditure estimate what is the fossil fuel subsidy. I know there have been other departments who have weighed in on this, but it'd be good to get finance to say something about it. And maybe, what do you think of that?
I think the Commissioner's report, didn't the Commissioner's report make that recommendation?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Dave, why are the gaps there?
Well, I think it's technical. I think it's just really, hard to do. There's a lot of big integrated companies, again, back to the sort of bottom up, that go to the returns and put somebody in a room in Calgary at the CRA that could, in revenue and figure it out. I mean, that was the conversation I had with the auditor who was thinking about, okay, how do we do this?
Yeah. There's all sorts of things that get in the way of it. I do recall when we did the work back quite a long time ago, it was pretty rough and ready, and you're right, you run into all sorts of definitional problems. But I'm struck by the gap. Bob, would you want to comment on that?
I think it's a definitional concern. Some people don't necessarily view that some of the arguments that are being raised are actually tax, are actually incentives as being characterized here.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of the mix. There's differences of opinion about whether it's an incentive or whether it's just a regular form of business in comparison to other parts of the industry. So.
Yeah, and I can attest to that. I can recall testifying once before the Environment Committee of the House of Commons, and Charles Katcher was the chair, and explaining something to Charles and his colleagues about the definition of tax expenditures. I'm still bearing the scars of that. Let me assure you, it is controversial. So I think John.
A niche question. Consider an energy industry that has quite a lot of research and development expenditure, and that arguably that's where the subsidies are for that particular industry. Do you have any special observations on R&D or science and technology as a target of expense of subsidization?
Yeah, so I mean, it's an economic question. Right? The economist would say, there's sort of, the innovator is not, capturing the full returns to their innovation and their expenditure. It's being reverse engineered, so it's ultimately innovation becomes a public good. So there's a role for governments to subsidize. I mean, that's why, all the economists who sit in the departments, say, okay, we can do with these, we can subsidize. So on the R&D side, there's all kinds of reasons why you would, provide R&D. And then there's all kinds of rules around how you implement R&D, so you don't pick winners. You don't pick fuel cells to start and throw all your money at fuel cells. You want to have broad-based innovation programs like we have the SRED credit, so you sort of send out a broad signal. And then you may want to have targeted subsidies for things like carbon capture and storage. So you may want to pick winners if you meet some conditions, like we can roll out a high cost technology with high abatement potential in our national inventory, so we can roll it out across big chunks of our national inventory. We can roll it out probably at flat costs once we get drive costs down, so there may be a role there to subsidize CCS. But when you think of that merit order, it's reversed, right? The way we generally practice policy in Canada is we sort of start with subsidies at the top, right? R&D subsidies and carbon pricing at the bottom. So we invert the preferred merit order of instruments and we pick winners. So we sort of flip it upside down.
Okay, David Reynolds, I'm going to give you the last quote. Sorry, Peter, did you want to comment on that?
Just a quick couple of comments on the R&D as well. That firstly, record it as a subsidy. It's still a subsidy, even if you believe it's a good one, fine. But record it as a subsidy, and same with every other measure. And secondly, accountants can be creative, and we see in certain countries that there's an awful lot of R&D subsidies that you wouldn't necessarily say were R&D. So if something's getting a tax break and other parts of operations aren't, there's a natural predisposition of people to recategorize and reclassify.
Indeed. Okay, David, you're at last.
Well, this might be worth the last word, actually. Peter, you may not have been around when Sylvia Austrie was the chair of our advisory committee, and she listened to that argument and said, remember how governments are very bad at picking winners, but losers are great at picking governments.
On that note, that seems like a good one to wrap it up. A really important topic and some very coolly analytical and very helpful comments coming on this one. This one tends to generate a lot of heat when people do start talking about it, but not very much light. And I think both of you have thrown a fair bit of light on a very, very complex subject. And thank you all for joining us, and thank Sustainable Prosperity and IISD for sponsoring it. And a hand for our speakers, and we'll get out of here.